There is a pattern in the events of the past decade that most Western analysts have been too close to see clearly. The United States withdraws from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017. China launches the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest free trade agreement in history, covering 14 Asia-Pacific nations and 30% of global GDP. The United States imposes sanctions on Russia and removes it from the SWIFT financial system in 2022. China deepens its energy partnership with Russia, absorbs Russian oil at discount prices, and accelerates the development of the cross-border interbank payment system, its alternative to SWIFT. The United States conducts Operation Epic Fury against Iran in February 2026, triggering the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the economic devastation of its Gulf Arab allies. China quietly ensures its tankers are among those permitted to transit the strait, deepens its relationship with the new Iranian leadership, and positions itself as the diplomatic alternative that a furious Saudi Arabia is now openly courting. In each case, the pattern is the same. America acts, sometimes wisely, sometimes not, and creates a vacuum. Political, diplomatic, economic, or strategic. And in each case, China steps into that vacuum with a preparation, a patience, and a strategic coherence that suggests not opportunism, but design. I'm Richard Hale, and in this video, the fourth in this channel's analytical series on the restructuring of the global order, I am going to show you exactly what China's long-term strategic design actually is, how it has been executing that design across every region of the world simultaneously, why the events of the past 4 years have accelerated its progress beyond what Beijing's own planners likely expected, and what the realistic picture of Chinese global power looks like over the next 20 years. If you have been watching this series from the beginning, the dollar video, the Strait of Hormuz video, the Saudi Arabia video, you already understand the three structural shifts that are creating the space into which China is moving. This video is where the picture comes into focus. If you are new to this channel, subscribe and turn on notifications. Ions now. And I strongly recommend going back to watch the first 3 videos in this series before continuing, because what I'm about to show you will make considerably more sense with that context. Let me start with the strategic framework, because understanding what China is doing requires understanding how China thinks about strategy, and that thinking is fundamentally different from the way Washington approaches geopolitical competition. American strategic culture is, in its deepest structure, episodic. It responds to crises. It mobilizes enormous resources for specific objectives. Defeating the Soviet Union, invading Iraq, containing Iran, and then struggles with the aftermath when those objectives are achieved or abandoned. It is extraordinarily powerful in the short term and chronically undisciplined in the long term. It wins battles and then loses the peace. It makes deals and then breaks them. It commits and then retreats. Chinese strategic culture, at least as it has been practiced under the Communist Party since 1949, and with particular sophistication under Xi Jinping since 2012, is in its deepest structure incremental. It does not seek dramatic victories. It seeks the progressive accumulation of positional advantage, the patient construction of the conditions under which Chinese power becomes the natural, default option for more and more countries across more and more domains, until at some point, the balance has shifted so far that the outcome is structurally determined without a single decisive confrontation ever having occurred. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what China is doing and why Washington has been so consistently slow to recognize and respond to it. You cannot counter an incremental positional strategy with an episodic crisis response. By the time the crisis becomes visible enough to trigger the American response mechanism, the incremental strategy has already moved on to the next layer of positional advantage. Now let me show you the specific domains in which China has been executing this strategy, because the breadth of it is what most Western analysis fails to capture. The first domain is infrastructure and economic connectivity, the Belt and Road Initiative. Launched in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative is the most ambitious infrastructure investment program in human history. By 2024, China had signed cooperation agreements with over 140 countries, representing approximately 75% of the world's nations and 65% of the world's population. Total committed investment across roads, railways, ports, pipelines, power plants, telecommunications networks, and financial institutions exceeded $1 trillion and was projected to reach $8 trillion by 2049, the centennial of the People's Republic. Most Western analysis of the Belt and Road focuses on its economic dimensions, the debt trap diplomacy critique, the question of whether the projects generate sufficient returns, the cases where Chinese loans have produced unsustainable debt burdens. These critiques have validity in specific cases, but they miss the primary strategic purpose of the initiative, which is not economic return, it is connectivity dependency. When China builds a port in Sri Lanka, a railway in Kenya, a pipeline in Pakistan, a power plant in Serbia, a telecommunications network in Saudi Arabia, it is not primarily seeking a financial return on those investments, though it certainly prefers one. It is creating physical and technical infrastructure that connects those countries to China rather than to Western systems. It is making Chinese technology, Chinese standards, Chinese financial systems, and Chinese political relationships the default architecture of development across the Global South. Once that infrastructure is built, once a country's ports run on Chinese logistics systems, its power grid on Chinese technology, its telecommunications on Huawei networks, its government finances on Chinese development bank loans, the switching costs of moving to a different patron become very high. Not impossible, but high enough that the default tends to persist. This is the logic of the Belt and Road as a strategic instrument. It is not colonialism. China is not seeking territorial control. It is seeking connectivity dependency, a world in which the infrastructure of development runs through Beijing rather than Washington, and in which countries that want to develop have stronger practical incentives to align with Chinese standards and Chinese preferences than with American ones. The second domain is financial architecture, the construction of an alternative to the dollar system. I covered this in detail in the first video of this series, so I will be brief here, but it is essential to understand the Belt and Road and the alternative financial architecture as a unified strategic project rather than two separate initiatives. The Belt and Road creates a structure dependency. The alternative financial architecture, CIPS, the yuan swap agreements, the BRICS New Development Bank, the discussion of a BRICS settlement currency, the gold accumulation strategy, creates financial dependency. Together, they are building a parallel world system in which countries can develop, trade, invest, and settle transactions without passing through American-controlled institutions. The pace of this construction has accelerated dramatically since 2022. The Russian reserve freeze, the moment when the United States demonstrated its willingness to confiscate the sovereign assets of a country it was in conflict with, did more to advance Chinese financial architecture ambitions than anything Beijing itself could have done. Every government in the world that holds dollar reserves now understands that those reserves can be frozen. Every government in the world that relies on SWIFT now understands that access can be revoked. China is offering an alternative, and the demand for that alternative has never been higher. The third domain is diplomatic influence, and here the recent record is extraordinary. The Saudi-Iran normalization of March 2023 was the most visible demonstration of Chinese diplomatic reach in the Middle East, a region where the United States had claimed indispensable mediator status for half a century. But it was not an isolated event. It was the most dramatic expression of a diplomatic strategy that has been operating across every region simultaneously. In Africa, China has become the continent's largest bilateral creditor and its largest trading partner. Chinese diplomatic engagement across sub-Saharan Africa has produced a cohort of governments that consistently align with Chinese positions in United Nations votes on human rights, on Taiwan, on sanctions, at a rate that has shifted the balance of multilateral institutions in ways that Washington is only now beginning to take seriously. In Latin America, historically the United States' own backyard, Chinese trade and investment have grown to the point where China is now the largest trading partner of Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, and a significant partner for every major economy in the region. The Monroe Doctrine, the foundational principle of American strategic primacy in the Western Hemisphere since 1823, has not been formally challenged. It has simply been rendered progressively less relevant by the practical economics of Latin American trade. In Southeast Asia, the region most directly in the shadow of Chinese power and most critical to any American strategy of containing Chinese influence, the picture is nuanced but directionally clear. Countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia are engaged in a careful balancing act between American security guarantees and Chinese economic relationships. But the trajectory of Chinese economic integration with the region, through RCEP, through bilateral investment, through infrastructure, is deepening faster than American engagement is strengthening. If you are finding this analysis useful, and what Xi Jinping has specifically done since 2012 to accelerate all of this is the part that changes how you understand the pace and ambition of this strategy, hit that like button and subscribe if you have not already. The fourth domain is technology, and this is where the competition is most acute and most consequential for this. Long-term. China's strategic planners understand something that most Western politicians are only beginning to articulate. The country that sets the standards for the technologies of the next generation, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, sixth-generation telecommunications, advanced semiconductors, green energy infrastructure, will have a structural advantage in every other domain of power for decades. This is why China's investment in technology development has been extraordinary in scale and systematic in focus. The Made in China 2025 initiative, announced in 2015, identified 10 strategic technology sectors and committed state resources to achieving global leadership in all of them by 2025. The subsequent New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan committed China to becoming the world's leading AI power by 2030. The American response, export controls on advanced semiconductors, restrictions on Chinese technology investment, the CHIPS Act to rebuild domestic semiconductor production, has been more aggressive and more coherent than most previous American responses to Chinese strategic initiatives. But it has also, in some dimensions, accelerated the very self-sufficiency it was designed to prevent. Chinese investment in domestic semiconductor development has surged in response to American export controls. Huawei, which American sanctions were intended to cripple, released a new generation of advanced chips in 2023 that demonstrated capabilities its American adversaries had believed were years away. The technology competition between the United States and China is genuinely uncertain in its outcome in a way that the other domains are not. America's lead in frontier AI, in advanced semiconductor design, in the software ecosystem, these are real and significant advantages. But China's scale of investment, its pool of engineering talent, and its willingness to mobilize state resources towards strategic technology objectives are closing the gap faster than most American analysts expected. The fifth domain is military posture, and here I want to make an analytical distinction that is frequently lost in Western coverage of Chinese military development. China is not trying to build a military that can defeat the United States in a global conventional war. Not the strategic objective. The strategic objective is to build a military that can deny the United States the ability to intervene decisively in China's immediate periphery, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the First Island chain, and thereby make the cost of American military intervention in those areas prohibitively high. This is what military strategists call an anti-access/area denial strategy, and China has been executing it with extraordinary discipline and investment for 30 years. Its anti-ship missile systems, the DF-21D and DF-26, designed specifically to threaten American aircraft carriers at ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers, have fundamentally changed the risk calculus for American naval operations in the Western Pacific. Its submarine fleet, its integrated air defense systems, its hypersonic missile development. All of it is designed not to project Chinese power globally, but to make the exercise of American power in China's neighborhood increasingly costly and uncertain. The implication of this strategy, if it succeeds, and the evidence suggests it is succeeding, is not Chinese global military dominance. It is Chinese regional military dominance in the Western Pacific, combined with the economic and diplomatic dominance across the global South that the Belt and Road and the alternative financial architecture are building simultaneously. A China that controls its immediate periphery militarily, while building economic and financial dependencies across the developing world, does not need to defeat the United States globally. It simply needs to make the United States progressively less relevant to the decisions of more and more countries, which is exactly what the combination of these 5 strategic domains is designed to achieve. Now, I want to bring all of this back to the specific moment we are living in, because the events of 2024, 2025, and 2026 have accelerated the execution of this strategy in ways that Beijing's own planners did not anticipate. The Iran war has done 3 things simultaneously for China's strategic position. First, it has consumed American military, diplomatic, and political resources at a moment when those resources were already stretched across Ukraine, across the Taiwan Strait, and across the domestic political divisions that have made consistent long-term American foreign policy increasingly difficult to sustain. Second, it has driven the Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, into active pursuit of the Chinese relationship as a strategic alternative, handing Beijing the most significant Middle Eastern diplomatic victory since Nixon's opening to China, in 1972. Third, it has demonstrated to every government in the world that was still uncertain that American military power, while overwhelming in its destructive capacity, does not translate reliably into the strategic outcomes its users intend. A war that aimed at regime change in Iran has produced an Iran that is still standing, a Strait of Hormuz that is largely closed, a Saudi Arabia that is reconsidering its American alignment, and a Russia that is collecting an energy revenue windfall, all while China watches from a position of strategic patience that is looking, in retrospect, like strategic genius. China did not cause the Iran war. China did not plan the strait closure. China did not engineer the Saudi realignment. It simply prepared the conditions, the alternative financial architecture, the Belt and Road connectivity, the diplomatic relationships, the military posture that allowed it to benefit from all 3 when they occurred. This is the master plan, not a secret document in a Beijing vault, not a conspiracy, but a strategic orientation, patient, incremental, positional, that has been visible to anyone who looked carefully for a decade, and that is now producing outcomes that its architects could not have timed better if they had tried. Let me close with the question that I think is most important and most honestly difficult to answer. Is this trajectory reversible? Can the United States, if it chooses to, arrest the erosion of its positional advantage and prevent China from consolidating the strategic gains it has? It's been accumulating. The honest answer is partially in some domains if the response is coherent and sustained. And there is significant reason to doubt that it will be. The American advantages that remain real and significant are formidable. The dollar's structural depth, the innovation ecosystem of Silicon Valley, the alliance network, frayed but still functional, that gives American power a multiplier that China's relationships cannot yet match. The military lead in open ocean naval warfare, in 5th-generation air power, in space, and in the most advanced AI systems. These are not trivial advantages. China has not yet won this competition, but the window for an effective American response is narrowing. The Belt and Road infrastructure, once built, is not easily dismantled. The alternative financial architecture, once established, is not easily shut down. The Saudi strategic pivot, once set in motion, is not easily reversed. The technology gap, once closed in critical sectors, is not easily reopened. The question for the United States is not whether it has the capacity to compete with China across all 5 of these domains? It clearly does. The question is whether its political system, divided, episodic, crisis-driven, and increasingly unable to sustain long-term strategic commitments across electoral cycles, can generate the coherent, patient, positional strategy that competing with China's approach actually requires. That is a question about American domestic politics as much as it is about foreign policy, and it is a question whose answer will determine the shape of the world for the next 50 years. China is not winning because it is stronger. It is winning because it is more patient. And patience in geopolitical competition is a form of power that democratic systems find very difficult to sustain. If this analysis changed the way you see China's global strategy, share it with someone who is still thinking about this as a simple military competition. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next piece of this picture. And tell me in the comments, which of the 5 domains I described do you think represents China's most decisive advantage? And where do you think America's most important opportunity to respond still lies? I'm Richard Hale, and I will see you in the next analysis.